What up, you fluffy bastards? My name is Liquid Blitz, and since ERANGEL 2.0 was released for PUBG, I've been testing again, and I've devised a brand new list of all the best settings to use for a high frame rate and the best possible player visibility. As with all my videos, the info is already on screen for the people who just want the info and don't want to listen to a bunch of explanations. That being said, if you do find the info actually useful, if you could hit that like button before you leave, that would help me immensely. Anyway, let's go through the list and explain each setting top to bottom. First and most basic, always use full screen mode, as that's generally known to be the most stable display mode. Next, in-game FPS cap. Now, the debate of capped versus uncapped FPS has been going on for years. There are pros and cons to both. Capping your FPS reduces the overall workload on your GPU, keeping it cooler and quieter, and capping it to the same value as your monitor's refresh rate, like 60Hz or 144Hz, eliminates screen tearing, and when paired with G-Sync or AMD's FreeSync, it works even better. The downside is a lower frame rate than you could potentially get. I've actually chosen this setting based on another factor altogether. As YouTuber Battle Nonsense researched, input lag actually varies with your frame rate. As he advises, it's better to limit your FPS to a level you can sustain most of the time to give you a consistent input lag. For example, during lots of crazy action, I tend to average around 135 to 155 FPS, so I've capped mine bang in the middle at 144, which just happens to be the refresh rate of my monitor, 144Hz, which is a really lucky bonus for me because that eliminates my screen tearing. So my advice is, work out an average frame rate that you can sustain most of the time, and set your FPS cap near that or just slightly above it to maintain a consistent input lag. Anyway, next, render scale. The higher this value, the sharper your overall image. I've chosen the default of 100. The frame rate difference between using 100 and the max of 120 is actually pretty significant, and the end result, visually speaking, isn't that much different. I find it largely depends on resolution and screen size. For me, I've got a 24-inch monitor at 1080p, and things look, honestly, perfectly crisp at 100. So I advise you stick with 100 unless you feel you can sacrifice a few frames for that extra clarity from 120%. As long as your FPS doesn't drop to unacceptable levels during fights, otherwise it's useless. To put the frame rate difference into perspective, when I personally increase the render scale from 100 to 120, I actually lose pretty much exactly 22 to 23 FPS consistently. And with a pretty damn average PC, I can't afford to lose 23 FPS, especially during fights. Next, first-person FOV, or field of view. The higher this value, the wider your peripheral vision, so the more stuff you can see to your sides. But there's two big problems with increasing your FOV. First, the higher the FOV, the lower your frame rate will be while moving because your screen has to render more stuff on the edges of the screen. And second, the wider your vision, the smaller everything directly in front of you will appear. Because if you think about it, increasing your FOV it's kind of like zooming out so you can see the sides more, so everything directly in front of you seems smaller. I decided that 90 was the perfect balance between high frame rate, decent peripheral vision, and not too distant looking front vision. Next, anti-aliasing. Oh Jesus. Aliasing is the jaggedness you see when the edges of objects are at an angle, and this is because the pixels that make up your screen are square. So when it comes to the teeny tiny minute details, it's literally impossible for the pixels to accurately render an angled edge. Anti-aliasing counters this in a variety of ways, the simplest of which is to blur the edges or make them translucent to sort of mask the jaggedness. Now, PUBG doesn't handle anti-aliasing very well. It has improved, but it's not great. On very low or low, for me personally, I cannot stand it. I find it so distracting because all the grass and fences are just like a flickering and a dancing. And I find when things are a flickering and a dancing, it's a lot harder to spot a moving player. So I want a high setting, but in PUBG, I personally find that Ultra is a little bit too blurry, and we lose some of that nice crispness that helps players stand out, especially in the distance. Which is why I have it set to high, not Ultra. Plus it gives you a tiny little extra FPS boost. Next, post-processing. Simply put, the better the post-processing, the more beautiful the visuals. So in a perfect world, we'd all have this on Ultra. But there's two things. Firstly, post-processing has a huge impact on your frame rate. I'm talking massive. In testing, going from very low to ultra, I lost between 50 and 60 FPS. And secondly, the more beautiful the game doesn't necessarily mean player visibility is better. Quite the contrary. I mean, when post-processing is set to high or above in PUBG, I find that something happens to indoor light, making it look sort of diffused and admittedly cool, but that doesn't mean you can spot players easier, especially if it's dark or sort of gloomy. On the flip side, the very low setting completely removes that nice, defined, crisp edge to everything. On very low specifically, all objects seem to blend together in a really off-putting way. So we don't want high or ultra for the weird indoor light, but we don't want very low either. I find medium to be the best balance between a higher frame rate and crisp, clear visibility both inside and outside. Next, shadows. Okay, as with post-processing, very low is disgusting, while low and above for shadows are all pretty acceptable. But because this video is not just about high FPS, it's also about player visibility, perhaps that's even more important, we need player shadows to be as crisp as humanly possible. Now, I spent hours in the training mode just testing every level of shadows, just looking at them all, and starting with very low, as soon as I bumped up to low, I found that the most shadows remained mediocre, but player shadows became far more deep and crisp. So low is pretty crisp with a higher FPS, making it probably the best choice. Medium, I found, adds a bit of diffusion, making it less clear but more realistic. High is a different story. That gets rid of the diffusion completely once again, and that makes it the most clear setting. Ultra then re-adds some of that diffusion for the extra realism. It's all very weird. So my advice is, if you have a beast of a computer and you can handle losing a few frames, I would go with high, but if you're like me and you only have an average crappy PC, I would stick with low. Avoid very low, medium, and ultra just because of that diffusion. We need crispness, damn it! Next, textures. Now, fortunately, in PUBG, you might be surprised to hear that frame rate for the texture setting actually doesn't make that much difference. In fact, in testing, I honestly struggled to find any difference in frame rate between medium and ultra. The lowdown is that the clearer and sexier the textures, simply the easier to spot players, and the less horrific the game looks. Very low is truly disgusting. Low's a little bit better, but still pretty nasty, and medium is where we get the biggest jump in quality, which is why I've chosen medium. And then high and ultra are obviously better and better still. Once again, if like me you've got an average PC, I'd just stick with medium because it looks nice and crisp on its own. But if you've got a beast mode PC, and because my testing revealed that there isn't that much frame rate difference between medium and ultra, you might just want to bump it up to ultra, just for that extra clarity for spotting players. Next, effects. Now, effects affects how good things like gunshot flashes and explosions look. It was discovered a while back by various other YouTubers that effects on anything but ultra actually doesn't show certain gun flash effects at certain distances, which made ultra pretty much necessary if you wanted the best possible player visibility. After ERANGEL 2.0 released, I've done a whole shitload of testing of like very low versus ultra, specifically with the gun flash effects lighting up the environment. And that old problem seems to have been fixed. No matter what I've tried to do, the gun flash looks pretty much identical now on every setting. But regardless, there's actually a much bigger problem with the effects setting. On Ultra, effects sacrifices a huge chunk of frame rate. I'm talking 30 plus FPS just to have it on Ultra. And for a setting that really doesn't offer much, I think that's just basically a waste of FPS. So turn this to very low. Next, foliage and view distance. Both of these settings dictate the distance at which certain things will appear. Foliage governs trees, bushes, grass, all the natural stuff, and view distance governs things like buildings and wrecks and debris and containers and all that man-made stuff. The higher both these settings are, the lower your frame rate is going to be while moving, because as you move, think of yourself on the map. As you move, what I call the circle of loading around you moves with you. So as you move, you're constantly loading and unloading things. So the bigger and more distant that circle is, the more stuff you have to constantly load and unload. Here's the thing. Even on very low for both of these settings, everything still loads up to 1000 to 1500 meters away. And I think that's plenty of distance. And since it gives you the best frame rate out of all those settings, very low is the way to go. Oh, and for those wondering if view distance affects players or vehicles, it doesn't. Not even vehicles. I did a bunch of tests. Vehicles tend to appear around 900 meters, no matter the circumstance, no matter what the view distance setting. Anyway, next, sharpen. For the longest time, I kept this setting off because the example on the settings page shows no difference whatsoever. It's an awful example. In fact, all the examples on the settings page are crap. Anyway, seeing some side-by-side comparisons online of the sharpen setting. With sharpen on, it does make things more crisp. It's hard to tell by toggling it in-game yourself, but when you see it side-by-side, it's clear. It makes things like grass and the edges of trees and things look a bit sharper. And here's the best part. It doesn't seem to affect frame rate at all. I was testing it for a while and the FPS number didn't budge even a little bit, so turn this on. Next, VSync. Oh, off. Fuck off, VSync. Off. VSync locks your frame rate to the same value as your monitor's refresh rate to eliminate screen tearing, but it introduces an ass load of lag, and no one wants an ass load. Or do they? Anyway, next. Motion blur off. Off motion blur off. Good Jesus, keep this off too. VSync and motion blur both suck balls. Motion blur makes things blurry when there is motion. Looks cool on like a racing game or something, sure, but in a competitive first-person shooter, blur is truly pointless to its core. And it makes it just infinitely harder to see stuff when you're moving. And you're always moving. Motion blur only exists to mask the fact that consoles have very low FPS. There's a little trade secret for you. Anyway, that's it for this video. Those are the best settings I can devise for a balance between high FPS and nice crisp player visibility. Like this video if you liked it, like this video if you didn't like it, subscribe if you want to see more similar content, and go and subscribe to my second YouTube channel if you want to see me crap my pants doing sort of let's plays of horror games and a few story games as well. Links to everything in the description. Discord, Twitter, Facebook, it's all there. Liquid Blitz, out.